March 12, 1943. Luftwaffe Base, Northern France. The briefing room smelled of boot polish and stale cigarette smoke. Hauptmann Rainer Voss stood before the chalkboard, sketching something that made the assembled pilots lean forward, then burst into laughter. Two thin fuselages, a connecting tail boom, a central nacelle suspended between them like an afterthought. "Gentlemen," Voss announced, his voice thick with theatrical contempt, "the Americans have sent us a gift, a flying fork." The room erupted. Oberleutnant Klaus Becker slapped his knee. "Do they eat with it or fly it?" Voss circled the twin booms with exaggerated care. "Notice the elegance. Two bodies where one would suffice, a tail that connects nothing, and this," he tapped the center pod, "a cockpit that sits like a chicken on a fence." More laughter. These were men who flew the Bf-109, a machine of brutal efficiency. Single engine, tight frame, pure German engineering compressed into lethal simplicity. The idea that anyone would bifurcate an aircraft, split its very essence into parallel columns, seemed not just foolish but philosophically wrong. "If I see one," Voss continued, settling into his chair with the confidence of 14 confirmed kills, "I aim for the middle. The whole thing will fold like bad origami." Outside, spring rain hammered the tarmac. Inside, the mockery continued. Someone suggested the Americans were building furniture, not fighters. Another proposed it was designed by a committee that couldn't agree on one fuselage, so they built two. Nobody mentioned that intelligence reports had flagged the P-38 as a high-altitude interceptor. Nobody discussed its twin Allison engines or its clustered nose armament. The shape itself was enough to dismiss it. Strange equaled weak. Unusual equaled vulnerable. Across the English Channel, in a cramped operations room that smelled of rain and mildew, Captain Elliot Ward stood before an identical chalkboard. The same twin boom silhouette, the same unconventional design. But here, nobody laughed. Ward's audience consisted of 12 American pilots, fresh from training, their faces still soft with the kind of youth that war hadn't yet hardened into permanent vigilance. He traced the aircraft's outline with methodical precision. "They're calling it a fork," Ward said quietly. "Let them." He pointed to the twin booms. "These aren't a design flaw. They're deliberate. The weight distribution eliminates torque in high-speed dives. Your Messerschmitt twists itself into a coffin past 400 knots. This doesn't." Silence. The only sound was rain against corrugated metal. The armament sits in the nose, 450 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all firing through a single convergence point. No wing-mounted spread, no guessing. You point, you hit. One pilot raised his hand. "Sir, what about maneuverability?" Ward smiled thinly. "You're not flying a circus act, you're flying physics. The Lightning doesn't dogfight, it dictates. Altitude, speed, energy management, you climb where they can't breathe. You dive where they can't follow. And when you fire, everything lands in the same square meter of sky." He turned back to the board and underlined the twin booms twice. "They laugh at the shape. We study what it does to the air." The pilots filed out into the rain. Ward remained, staring at the chalk drawing. Somewhere over France, men were making jokes about forks. But jokes required breath, and breath required time. Time, Ward knew, was not a resource humor could afford much longer. In Berlin, in a ministry office overlooking bomb-damaged streets, Oberst Heinrich Steinhoff reviewed reconnaissance photographs. Blurry images, distant silhouettes, that same strange twin-boom configuration appearing over Tunisia, Sicily, the Italian coast. He wrote in the margin, "Unconventional design. Recommend surveillance." The recommendation was filed. Not urgent, not threatening, just strange. Steinhoff placed the photograph in a folder marked minor concerns and moved on to more pressing matters: fuel shortages, production delays, the endless hemorrhage of experienced pilots. An oddly shaped American fighter barely registered. 3 weeks later, a Bf-109 pilot named Lieutenant Hans Müller would encounter a P-38 over the Mediterranean. His radio transmission, recorded by ground stations, would last 7 seconds. Twin-boom aircraft diving. Impossible speed. He's not turning, he's just static. The fork had stopped being funny. It had started being final, but that understanding would come later, in the space between mockery and memory, where shapes cease being abstract and become something closer to prophecy. The lightning wasn't just a machine. It was an argument written in aluminum and physics, and the rebuttal would be written in smoke. They laughed at the fork. Soon, they would learn to fear its teeth. April 1943. The Mediterranean Theater. The war in the air had settled into a rhythm of arrogance. German pilots owned the sky not through numbers, but through certainty. A psychological monopoly built on 2 years of victories that had become muscle memory. The Bf-109 and Fw-190 were not just aircraft. They were extensions of a doctrine that equated engineering purity with tactical supremacy. In North Africa, the Luftwaffe flew with the casual confidence of landlords inspecting property. Allied bombers were targets. Allied escorts were delays. The P-40 Warhawks and Spitfires posed problems, yes, but problems with known solutions: turn rates, climb speeds, ammunition counts. Everything could be calculated, countered, conquered. Then the forks began appearing. At first sporadic. A twin-boom silhouette reported over Bizerte, another near Tunis. Intelligence summaries mentioned them in passing. Twin-engine fighter, American origin, limited engagement. The word limited did heavy lifting. It suggested rarity, uncertainty, a platform still finding its purpose. What it didn't suggest was lethality. Hauptmann Voss received his first detailed briefing on the P-38 in late April. The intelligence officer, a pale man named Hartmann who wore glasses that magnified his exhaustion, distributed typed sheets with clinical efficiency. Lockheed P-38 Lightning, twin-boom configuration, 2 Allison V1710 engines, top speed estimated at 370 miles per hour. Service ceiling 39,000 feet. Armament concentrated in nose assembly. Voss scanned the document with the disinterest of a man reading a menu in a language he didn't respect. 39,000 feet? Correct, Herr Hauptmann. And they expect to fight up there, where the air is so thin even thoughts freeze. Scattered chuckles from the assembled pilots. But Hartmann didn't smile. He had seen something in the reports that humor couldn't dismantle. There have been 3 confirmed engagements. In each case, the Lightning attacked from altitude with vertical dives exceeding 450 knots. Our pilots reported difficulty maintaining visual contact during evasive maneuvers. Voss waved dismissively. Any aircraft can dive. The question is whether it can pull out without shedding wings. Intelligence suggests it can, Herr Hauptmann. The twin-boom structure appears to provide unusual stability under high G loads. The room absorbed this information with the selective attention of men who had already decided what mattered. Strange design. American over-engineering. Probably heavy. Probably slow to turn. Probably vulnerable in horizontal combat where real fighting happened. Nobody asked why the Americans would build an aircraft optimized for conditions German fighters avoided. Nobody questioned the strategic implications of an enemy platform that could operate with impunity at altitudes where the Bf-109 supercharger wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. The intelligence report was filed. The briefing concluded. The forks remained a curiosity, not a crisis. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, the first fighter group was learning what the Lightning could do when flown by pilots who understood its nature. Captain Ward's squadron had transitioned from P-38s to a philosophy that contradicted every dogfighting instinct trained into conventional pilots. Forget everything you learned about turning, Ward told them during a sunrise briefing in Tunisia. The air smelled of aviation fuel and desert dust. The Lightning doesn't outturn anything. It outthinks everything. He drew vertical lines on the briefing board, altitude bands stacked like layers of atmosphere. You fight in 3 dimensions, not 2. The Messerschmitt lives in the horizontal plane. Bank, turn, roll, repeat. You live in the vertical. Climb until they can't follow. Dive until they can't react. Fire when geometry gives you certainty, not proximity. Lieutenant Richard Fisher, a former crop duster from Iowa with hands too large for his flight gloves, raised a concern. Sir, what if they force us into a turning fight? Then you've already lost, Ward replied. But they can't force what they can't catch. Your speed advantage begins at 15,000 feet. By 25,000, you're untouchable. By 35,000, you're hunting. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Use altitude as both weapon and fortress. The twin Allison engines, equipped with turbo superchargers that force-fed oxygen into the combustion chambers, maintained power where German engines suffocated. The P-38 could climb to altitudes where the air was so thin that exposed skin would bleed from pressure changes, and still accelerate. More importantly, it could dive from those altitudes without the structural failure that plagued other designs. The twin-boom configuration distributed stress across two load-bearing structures instead of one. The counter-rotating propellers eliminated torque. The result was an aircraft that fell like physics itself, straight, fast, and utterly indifferent to the pilot's nerve. The Germans had no equivalent answer because they had never asked the question. Their fighters were built for the killing altitude band between 10 and 20,000 feet, where visibility was sharp and air was thick enough for aggressive maneuvering. The Lightning simply existed above that realm, waiting. The first real understanding came on April 18, 1943, though it would take weeks for the implications to spread through Luftwaffe command. A P-38 squadron intercepted Admiral Yamamoto's transport near Bougainville, a mission requiring a 1,600-mile round trip over open ocean. The Forks flew it. They executed it. They returned. No German fighter could match that range, not even close. The operational radius wasn't just a number, it was a redefinition of what fighter aircraft meant. You couldn't defend against something that could appear anywhere. News of Yamamoto's death reached Europe through intelligence channels. Voss read the summary with something approaching unease. The Americans had flown further than thought possible, executed a precision interception, and returned safely. The twin-boom design suddenly looked less like comedy and more like calculation. Still, he told himself, the Pacific was different. Vast distances, minimal opposition. Over Europe, where Luftwaffe bases formed an interlocking network of firepower and expertise, things would be different. He was right, of course. Over Europe, things would be different, just not in the direction he imagined. By May, the jokes about flying forks had grown stale. In their place, a new phrase emerged in Luftwaffe ready rooms, spoken with the cautious tone of men discovering an uncomfortable truth. Avoid the twin boom if possible. Not engage cautiously. Not prioritize as target. Avoid. The shape they had mocked was becoming the shape they watched for, the silhouette that changed the calculus of every sortie. And the Lightning pilots, those strange Americans who flew an aircraft that refused to play by established rules, were just beginning to understand the gift Lockheed had handed them. A gift wrapped in aluminum and physics, a gift the enemy had laughed at. Until laughter required breath they could no longer afford to waste. June 14, 1943, skies over northern Italy. The revelation came not as thunder but as mathematics, cold, irrefutable, written in contrails at 28,000 feet. Hauptmann Rainer Voss was leading a swarm of 4 Bf-109 G6s on patrol above the Po Valley when the radio crackled with a warning from ground control. American bombers inbound from the south, heavy escort presence, vector northeast to intercept. The sky was a perfect cerulean, the kind of blue that seemed painted rather than atmospheric. Visibility stretched to the curve of the earth. Voss scanned the horizon with the practiced rhythm of a predator. Left, center, right, up, repeat. His wingmen maintained loose formation, Messerschmitt slicing through thin air with the confidence of ownership. Then he saw them. Not the bombers first, but their guardians. 6 twin-boom silhouettes stacked in pairs at 32,000 feet, moving with the unhurried certainty of sharks patrolling deep water. The Forks. Voss felt his jaw tighten. This would be different from shooting down lumbering B-17s or tangling with Spitfires in the usual altitude bands. This required climbing into the Lightning's domain. Climbing to engage, he transmitted, pulling back on the stick. The Daimler-Benz engine roared in response, but the roar lacked conviction. At this altitude, the DB-605 was gasping. Compression ratios falling. Manifold pressure dropping. Each 1,000 feet gained becoming a negotiation with physics, rather than a command. The P-38s didn't react. They simply waited, maintaining their altitude with mechanical indifference. Voss pushed his aircraft harder, watching the climb rate decay as the altimeter crawled past 26,000 feet. The engine temperature was rising. His own breathing came harder through the oxygen mask, each inhalation a conscious effort. 28,000 feet. The Bf-109 was shuddering now, the wings protesting against air too thin to provide clean lift. Voss leveled off, knowing that any higher would transform his fighter from weapon to casualty. He was still 4,000 feet below the Americans, and that's when the first lightning peeled off. The dive was vertical. Absolutely vertical. Not the angled descent of conventional combat, but a geometric line drawn from sky to earth, as if gravity had been given purpose and direction. Voss saw the twin booms align like rifle sights, saw the central nacelle grow from dot to silhouette in the span of 2 heartbeats. He tried to brake left. The Bf-109 responded with the sluggish reluctance of an aircraft operating at the edge of its envelope. The lightning didn't follow his turn. It simply continued downward, accelerating through 400 knots, 450, 500, speeds that should have torn control surfaces away or locked ailerons into uselessness. The lightning's nose lit up. Not the scattered flash of wing-mounted guns, but a concentrated strobe. 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon firing through a convergence point that required no guesswork, no lead calculation, no prayer that spread patterns would intersect with target. Point and hit. Geometry made lethal. Voss's wingman, Oberleutnant Becker, ceased to exist. One moment he was banking right. The next his aircraft was separating into components. Engine cowling, canopy fragments, a wing folding backward against its own structure. No explosion, just disassembly, clinical and complete. The lightning didn't slow. It converted altitude into speed, pulled out of the dive at 12,000 feet, with a turn radius so tight it should have grayed out the pilot, then climbed, back toward its squadron with engine power that defied the conservation of energy Voss understood. Turbo superchargers. The word surfaced in his mind like a curse. While his engine wheezed for oxygen, the Lightning's Allisons were being force-fed compressed air, maintaining sea-level power at altitudes where normal engines became decorative. The Americans weren't flying higher because they were brave. They were flying higher because their engines didn't care. "Brake! Brake!" someone screamed over the radio. Another Lightning was diving, then another. The sky became a vertical battlefield where German fighters struggled to maneuver in air too thin for aggressive tactics, while American aircraft treated altitude like ammunition. Spend it, regain it, spend it again. Voss dove, not to engage but to escape, pushing his Messerschmitt into a screaming descent that made the wings creak and the control stick vibrate with structural protest. At 15,000 feet he pulled out, hard hammering, oxygen mask fogged with condensation from hyperventilating breaths. He looked up. The P-38s had already regained their station at 32,000 feet, reformed into their patient pairs, untouchable and unbothered. They hadn't chased. They didn't need to. The fight had been conducted entirely on their terms, altitude dictating engagement, speed determining survival, firepower concentrated into geometric certainty. The revelation was complete. The twin-boom configuration wasn't ugly. It was optimized. The separation of engines eliminated torque that would have twisted any single-engine fighter into a death spiral during those 500-knot dives. The central nacelle placed the pilot between the engines, giving perfect forward visibility without the blind spots created by nose-mounted power plants. The clustered armament turned every shot into a surgical strike rather than a scattered hope. In the range. Dear God, the range. Voss's fuel gauge already showed concern, and he was still over friendly territory. Those Lightnings had flown from North Africa, fought at altitude for 30 minutes, and would fly back, 800 miles each way, carrying enough ammunition and fuel to rewrite the meaning of escort fighter. Back at base, Voss's after-action report was clinical. Engaged 6 P-38s at altitude, lost 1 aircraft. Enemy demonstrated superior climb rate, dive speed, and sustained high-altitude performance. Current tactics insufficient. Recommend avoiding engagement above 25,000 feet. The intelligence officer who received the report, the same pale Hartman with his magnifying glasses, read it twice before filing it with the growing stack of similar assessments. The stack was getting thick. The jokes had stopped weeks ago. In their place, a new reality was crystallizing. The Lightning didn't need to outmaneuver German fighters. It simply needed to exist where they couldn't, strike from angles they couldn't counter, and return to altitudes they couldn't reach. It was fighting a different war, vertical where theirs was horizontal, patient where theirs was aggressive, geometric where theirs was instinctive. That night in the operations room of the 1st Fighter Group, Captain Ward reviewed gun camera footage from the day's mission. The film showed a Bf-109 attempting a climbing intercept, its movements increasingly sluggish as altitude robbed its engine of power. Then the dive, the convergence, the disassembly. "Sir," Lieutenant Fisher asked quietly, "why don't they just stop climbing toward us?" Ward didn't look away from the projector. "Because they're protecting bombers. Because orders say engage. Because doctrine hasn't caught up with physics yet." He paused the film on a frame showing a P-38 pulling out of its dive, the twin booms perfectly parallel, the central nacelle a study in aerodynamic purpose. "They called it a fork," Ward said. "They should have called it a lesson in what happens when you laugh at geometry." The projector clicked. The film continued. Somewhere over Italy, the shape that had been mockery was teaching a curriculum written in altitude and speed, and the tuition was paid in aircraft that couldn't climb high enough to argue. July through October 1943, the psychological unraveling. The collapse began not with battles lost, but with battles avoided. By midsummer, Luftwaffe pilots across the Mediterranean and European theaters had developed an instinct that bypassed conscious thought, a visceral recognition that occurred in the primitive parts of the brain responsible for survival rather than strategy. See twin booms, assess altitude, disengage. It wasn't cowardice, it was mathematics internalized into muscle memory. Young pilots who had never encountered a P-38 absorbed the lesson through briefings that grew increasingly terse. Twin-engine fighter, American, operates above 8,000 meters. Avoid vertical engagement. The word avoid carried implications that doctrine manuals couldn't articulate. Don't fight what you can't catch. Don't chase what won't run. Don't engage what exists in a dimension of combat your aircraft wasn't built to enter. The strategic consequences rippled outward like fractures in stressed metal. German bomber formations, previously protected by altitude and fighter screens, began requesting deeper escorts. But escort fighters could only accompany bombers as high as their engines allowed. And bombers flew where oxygen was scarce. And defensive fire became a negotiation with physics. The P-38s prowled above both, patient as buzzards, waiting for the inevitable moment when fuel concerns forced German escorts to turn back. Then the forks descended. Clean kills against bombers stripped of protection. Crews who survived reported the same pattern. Distant silhouettes at impossible altitude, sudden vertical approaches, concentrated fire that didn't spray but pierced, and then, nothing. The Lightnings climbed back to their stations without pursuit, without risk, without apparent effort. Oberst Heinrich Steinhoff, the same man who had filed the P-38 under minor concerns 5 months earlier, now stared at loss reports that defied his understanding of air combat economics. In a single week over Italy, the Luftwaffe had lost 18 bombers to P-38 attacks. Conventional wisdom said fighters couldn't maintain the fuel reserves for sustained high-altitude patrol, while still carrying combat-effective ammunition loads. Conventional wisdom had been designed by people who didn't have turbo superchargers. "They're flying from Africa," Steinhoff's aide reported, placing reconnaissance photos on the desk. 800 kilometers each way, fighting for 40 minutes in the target area. Returning with fuel to spare. Steinhoff studied the images, P-38s on North African airstrips, their twin booms casting distinctive shadows in the desert sun. He had thought range was a theoretical specification, a number inflated by American marketing. Now that number was destroying his bomber groups with the reliability of a mathematical proof. "What's their loss rate?" he asked. The aide hesitated. "In the past month, across all theaters where they operate, 4 confirmed, 2 probable." 6 aircraft, against 63 German losses attributed to P-38 attacks in the same period. The exchange ratio wasn't just unfavorable, it was apocalyptic. And the worst part was that the 6 American losses hadn't come from air combat. They had come from mechanical failures, navigation errors, one mid-air collision. Not a single P-38 had been shot down by a German fighter in 4 weeks. You couldn't destroy what you couldn't reach. You couldn't reach what existed in a vertical dimension your aircraft treated as theoretical. And you couldn't train pilots to overcome limitations that were metallurgical rather than tactical. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Lockheed's production lines were accelerating. The P-38 wasn't an experimental platform or a limited production specialty aircraft. It was being manufactured at a rate of 500 per month, each one equipped with those damned turbo superchargers, each one capable of flying further than any German fighter, each one able to climb to altitudes where Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs became expensive gliders. The strategic mathematics were brutal. Every P-38 forced German fighters to operate defensively. Every defensive posture surrendered initiative. Every surrendered initiative allowed Allied bombers to operate with increasing impunity. And every bomber raid necessitated more German fighters, which meant more fuel consumption, more pilot training, more resources diverted from an industrial base already straining under the weight of a war on multiple fronts. The fork wasn't just winning air battles, it was winning the calculus of attrition. In France, Hauptmann Voss sat in a briefing room that had lost its swagger. The jokes had died months ago. In their place was a professional grimness that acknowledged reality without accepting it. The intelligence officer, Hartmann, still pale, still wearing those magnifying glasses, delivered updates with the affect of a physician discussing terminal diagnosis. New directive from command. P-38 formations are to be reported immediately and avoided, unless overwhelming numerical advantage permits engagement. Priority targets remain bombers. Fighter-to-fighter combat with twin-boom aircraft is considered tactically disadvantageous. Someone in the back asked the question everyone was thinking: what do we do when they're escorting the bombers? Silence. Because the answer was obvious and unbearable. You tried anyway, knowing the mathematics were against you, knowing the altitude advantage was insurmountable, knowing that somewhere above your operational ceiling, American pilots were watching through gun sights that didn't need to guess where bullets would go. The psychological impact was worse than the tactical one. German pilots had been trained in a tradition that emphasized aggression, individual skill, the supremacy of the hunting ace who accumulated kills through superior reflexes and mechanical mastery. The P-38 invalidated that entire framework. It didn't matter how skilled you were if the enemy could dictate every variable of engagement: altitude, speed, angle of attack, duration. Some pilots developed superstitions. Don't look up past 25,000 feet. Stay near clouds for concealment. If you see twin shadows, dive immediately without attempting assessment. The superstitions were tactical wisdom disguised as ritual, survival instincts wrapped in the language of luck. Others simply broke. A lieutenant named Werner Schmidt returned from patrol claiming engine trouble, though ground crews found nothing wrong. On his 4th consecutive mechanical issue, the flight surgeon grounded him. Schmidt didn't protest. He had seen the fork descend 3 times. He had watched aircraft disappear into component parts. He had learned that some shapes in the sky weren't worth approaching, regardless of orders. The Americans, reading intelligence reports derived from interrogated prisoners and intercepted communications, began to understand what they had created. The P-38 wasn't just an aircraft. It was a psychological weapon that operated through presence as much as action. German formations altered their flight paths to avoid areas where lightnings were reported. Bomber raids were scrubbed when P-38 escort was confirmed. Entire operational plans shifted based on whether those twin booms would be prowling at altitude. Captain Ward, now promoted to major and commanding an entire squadron, read a captured German memo that had been circulated to Luftwaffe units. The translation was clinical. Aircraft with twin-boom configuration represent significant tactical challenge. Engagement should be avoided unless combat conditions favor altitude parity and numerical superiority of at least 3 to 1. 3 to 1. The Germans needed to outnumber them 3-1 just to consider engagement feasible. And even then, only if altitude was equal, a condition the P-38 pilots would never permit. Ward showed the memo to Lieutenant Fisher, who read it twice before laughing without humor. "They're scared of us. They're scared of physics," Ward corrected. "We're just the ones flying it." By October, the transformation was complete. The shape that had inspired mockery now inspired tactical withdrawal. Luftwaffe pilots who saw those distinctive parallel booms didn't think target. They thought threat, followed immediately by escape vector. The fork had become fear. And fear, unlike aircraft, couldn't be manufactured, couldn't be replaced, couldn't be overcome through doctrine or determination. It could only be endured, one mission at a time, one glance skyward at a time, one recognition that the strange American fighter with the ugly design had redefined air superiority through a combination of engineering and altitude that no amount of pilot skill could overcome. The collapse wasn't dramatic. It was statistical. A gradual recognition that some battles were lost before they began, written in turbo supercharger specifications and twin-boom stress distribution diagrams, written in mathematics that didn't care about tradition or bravery or the pride of fighter pilots who had ruled the sky. The sky had new rules now, and the lightning had written them at 35,000 feet, where German engines couldn't argue. December 1943, the understanding. The lesson wasn't taught in classrooms or written in manuals. It was absorbed through loss, internalized through survival, and finally understood in the quiet moments when men confronted what their arrogance had cost them. Hauptmann Rainer Voss stood in the same briefing room where he had once sketched a fork and made men laugh. 6 months had passed. The room was quieter now. Half the faces were different. Younger replacements who hadn't earned the right to laugh yet, who arrived with textbook knowledge but no understanding of how quickly the sky could teach humility. The chalkboard still bore traces of his original drawing, faint lines never fully erased. Someone had added notes in cramped handwriting. Altitude advantage critical. Avoid engagement above 7,000 manwers. Report and evade. Voss traced the twin-boom outline with chalk that felt heavier than it should. No jokes this time. No theatrical contempt. Just facts delivered in the monotone of a man reciting a lesson he had paid to learn. "The Americans built an aircraft that doesn't fight the way we fight," he said. "It doesn't turn with us because it doesn't need to. It doesn't chase because it can wait. It operates in a vertical dimension we can reach but cannot sustain." The young pilots listened with the intensity of students who understood that this lecture determined their life expectancy. "They were not stupid for building something ugly," Voss continued. "We were stupid for believing that ugly meant weak." The admission hung in the air like smoke. This was the lesson distilled to its essence. They had confused aesthetics with effectiveness, tradition with truth. The Bf-109 was beautiful. A single engine, clean lines, the platonic ideal of a fighter aircraft. The P-38 was strange, bifurcated, asymmetric in its symmetry, a design that violated every convention. But conventions were written by men who didn't have turbo superchargers. Across the channel, Major Ward was teaching the opposite lesson to replacement pilots fresh from the States. Young men who arrived expecting dogfights and glory, who had watched too many films where aerial combat was ballet performed at close range. "The lightning doesn't prove you're a better pilot," Ward told them. "It proves you understand physics better than the enemy. You're not knights jousting in the sky. You're mathematicians solving problems in 3 dimensions." He pointed to a chart showing altitude bands color-coded by engine performance. The German fighters dominated the green zone, 10 to 20,000 feet, where air was thick and engines sang. The P-38 owned the blue zone, 25 to 40,000 feet, where oxygen was scarce and conventional engines gasped. You fight where they suffocate. You dive faster than they can follow. You climb to altitudes where their aircraft becomes a liability. This isn't courage, it's geometry. And geometry doesn't care about bravery. The lesson was philosophical as much as tactical. Wars were decided not by who fought hardest, but by who understood the battlefield most completely. The Germans had built fighters for the war they expected, horizontal combat turning engagements, dogfights that rewarded reflexes and aggression. The Americans had built a fighter for the war that actually existed, a conflict where altitude meant survival, where range determined strategic reach, where concentrated firepower eliminated the need for sustained engagement. One side had optimized for tradition, the other had optimized for reality. In Berlin, Oberst Steinhoff compiled his final report on the P-38 threat assessment. The document was candid in ways that official military documents rarely permitted. The enemy aircraft designated P-38 represents not a superior fighter, but a superior fighting system. Its twin-boom configuration, initially dismissed as ungainly, provides structural advantages in high-speed maneuvers that single-engine designs cannot match. Its turbo-supercharged engines operate effectively at altitudes where our fighters experience significant performance degradation. Most critically, its operational range allows strategic flexibility that negates our defensive advantages. He paused before writing the final paragraph, knowing it would be read by commanders who still believed in the supremacy of German engineering, who thought will and skill could overcome material disadvantage. Recommendation: development of high-altitude interceptor with similar performance characteristics should be expedited. Current fighter doctrine assumes altitude parity. This assumption is no longer valid. The report was filed, discussed, and ultimately ignored, not because the information was wrong, but because admitting its implications meant acknowledging that German aviation had spent 3 years optimizing for the wrong variables. Easier to believe that American pilots were simply avoiding fair fights than to accept that there was no such thing as a fair fight. Only fights conducted on terms that favored one side's engineering decisions. The fork had taught them something their doctrine couldn't accommodate. That innovation often looked absurd until it started working. That unconventional solutions to complex problems frequently violated aesthetic preferences, and that mocking what you didn't understand was just arrogance waiting to become education. By late 1943, the P-38's reputation had crystallized into something approaching mythology. New Luftwaffe pilots were warned about it during training, not as one threat among many, but as the threat that redefined how air combat worked. See the twin booms, break engagement, report position, survive to fight something you could actually reach. The lesson, ultimately, was simple. They had laughed at a shape. The shape had responded with physics, and physics, unlike pride, couldn't be defeated through determination or dismissed through contempt. The Lightning didn't win through superiority of spirit or excellence of piloting. It won because Lockheed had asked the right questions, and the Germans had mocked the answers. It won because altitude mattered more than agility. It won because range determined where battles could be fought. It won because concentrated nose armament made every trigger pull an equation with one solution. It won because someone had built a fork and understood what forks were for. Not stirring air, but piercing it. Not dancing through the sky, but dominating it through presence alone. The Americans had built something strange. The Germans had learned, too late, that strange was just another word for effective. April 1945, the final encounter. The war was ending, though nobody could say exactly when the end would arrive. The skies over Germany had changed. No longer contested territory, but hunting grounds where Allied aircraft moved with the casual authority of ownership. Hauptmann Rainer Voss was flying his final missions in an Me-262, the jet fighter that was supposed to change everything. Fast, revolutionary. A technological leap that should have restored German air superiority. But technology without fuel was just expensive metal, and the Reich was running on fumes and desperation. He was returning to base, turbines throttled back to conserve what little kerosene remained, when he saw them. 2 P-38s at 20,000 feet, flying lazy circles above the airfield. Waiting. Voss knew what they were doing. The Lightning pilots had learned that jet fighters were vulnerable during landing. Slow, heavy, unable to maneuver without risking a stall. So they waited at altitude, patient as wolves, watching the circuit pattern. He had no choice. His fuel gauge showed minutes, not hours. Land or glide down as a casualty of arithmetic. As his landing gear extended, One of the lightnings peeled off. That same vertical dive he had witnessed 2 years ago over Italy. The same geometric precision. The same inevitable mathematics of altitude converted to speed, converted to lethality. But this time, the lightning didn't fire. It descended parallel to Voss's approach, matching his speed, close enough that he could see the pilot's helmet, the worn paint on the twin booms, the gun ports in the nose that could have ended him with a 2-second burst. The American pilot looked across the gap between them. No aggression, no triumph, just acknowledgement. Then the lightning pulled up, climbed away, and resumed its patrol station. Voss landed, taxied to the revetment, and sat in the cockpit long after the turbines spooled down. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from understanding. The American could have killed him. The geometry was perfect, the target helpless, the opportunity absolute. But there was no point. The war was over and everything but paperwork. Shooting down one more pilot wouldn't change the outcome, wouldn't alter the equations that had been written in turbo supercharger specifications and twin boom stress tolerances. The Lightning pilot, it was Major Ward, though Voss would never know his name, had made a calculation that transcended tactics. The fork had proven its point. It didn't need one more kill to validate what 2 years of combat had already demonstrated. 3 weeks later, the war in Europe ended. Voss survived to see the unconditional surrender, the occupation, the reckoning. In the years that followed, he would sometimes stand at air shows where restored P-38s flew demonstration passes, their twin booms slicing through air with the same geometric authority he remembered. People would point and marvel at the unusual design. Strange-looking aircraft, they would say. Wonder why they built it that way. Voss never explained. How could he articulate that every curve of those twin booms, every decision that made the Lightning look unconventional, had been optimized for a form of combat that his own Air Force had refused to acknowledge until the lesson was being taught at 35,000 feet? The P-38 hadn't won through brute force or overwhelming numbers. It had won through understanding, a recognition that air combat was evolving into a vertical dimension, where altitude determined survival, where range meant strategic reach, where concentrated firepower eliminated the romance of dogfighting and replaced it with mathematical certainty. They had mocked the fork. The fork had taught them that mockery was just ignorance waiting to be educated. In California, at a Lockheed facility where engineers were already designing the next generation of fighters, a young aeronautical student asked Kelly Johnson, the man who had overseen the P-38's development, why the twin-boom configuration had been chosen. Johnson's answer was characteristically direct, because it was the right solution to the problem. Not the prettiest, not the most conventional. Just right, the student pressed. But didn't people think it looked strange? Johnson smiled thinly. Strange is what people call things they don't understand yet. Give them time. Either they learn, or the strange thing teaches them. The Lightning had taught an entire Air Force that lesson. It had transformed mockery into mathematics, jokes into geometry, laughter into the quiet respect that comes from understanding what you're actually looking at. The fork had become fear. Then it had become something more permanent, proof that innovation often arrives in shapes that violate expectation, that effectiveness and aesthetics answer different questions, and that the strangest-looking solution is sometimes the only one that actually works. Voss died in 1987, an old man whose war stories had become history lessons. But he never forgot the moment that Lightning pilot looked across at him and chose mercy over mathematics. It was the final lesson of a shape that had taught so many. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one you don't need to use, because everyone already knows what it can do. The twin booms cast their shadow across a generation of aviation design, not because they were beautiful, but because they were right. And in the end, in the unforgiving physics of aerial combat, being right was the only aesthetic that mattered. The fork had taught them all. Respect the shape of things you don't understand, because understanding comes quickly when it's written in contrails at 35,000 feet, delivered by something that looks like a joke but fights like mathematics itself.